In the vast, sprawling estate of the wealthy Sterling family, the air always smelled of lemon polish and expensive flowers. It was a quiet place, mostly filled with the sound of silence, except for the soft footsteps of the staff. Among them was a young woman named Maria. She was the housekeeper. It's a woman who worked tirelessly from the moment the sun came up until long after it went down. Her hands were rough from scrubbing, and her back often ached, but she had a smile that could light up a room. She worked hard not just for herself, but for her 10-year-old son, Leo. Leo was a quiet boy. He didn't run around causing trouble or make loud noises. He spent most of his time sitting in the corner of the main living hall, watching his mother work. While Maria cleaned the large glass windows and dusted the expensive shelves, Leo would sit on a small wooden bench in the corner, his eyes fixed on the most beautiful object in the room, the grand piano. The piano was black and shiny. Sitting like a giant beast in the middle of the hallway, it looked out of place among the cold marble floors and the stiff furniture. To Leo, it wasn't just furniture. It was magic. He had never touched it. He knew the rules. He was the son of the help, and the piano was for the people who owned the house. But that didn't stop him from loving it. He would stare at the keys, imagining what they would sound like. In his head, he could hear songs loud, booming songs, and soft whispering songs. He didn't know how to read music, and he had never taken a lesson. But he had a gift. He had perfect pitch. He could hear a sound once and remember it forever. He could hear a bird chirping outside the window and know exactly which note on the piano would match it. One afternoon, the house was strangely still. Mr. and Mrs. Sterling were out for the day, attending some important event in the city. The other staff members were in the kitchen or the lower quarters taking a break. The large living hall was empty. Maria was in the back garden, pulling weeds from the flower beds. Leo was alone with his thoughts. The silence in the room felt heavy. It pressed against Leo's ears. He looked around. There was no one there. He looked at the piano. The polished wood reflected the light coming in through the high windows. It looked like it was waiting for him. Slowly, Leo stood up. His legs felt shaky. He walked toward the instrument, his sneakers making barely a sound on the thick carpet. When he stood right in front of it, it seemed even bigger. He took a deep breath. Just one note, he told himself. Just to see what it feels like. He lifted his right hand. His fingers were small and tanned from the sun. He reached out and pressed down on the white key in the middle of the keyboard. A clear, bright sound rang out. It echoed through the large room, bouncing off the high ceiling. Leo smiled. It was a beautiful sound. It felt like the piano was talking back to him. Emboldened, he pressed another key. Then another. He wasn't playing a song he knew. He was just experimenting. But then a melody popped into his head. It was a simple lullaby, one he vaguely remembered from when he was very small. He started to play. He didn't know the proper technique. His fingers moved slowly, searching for the right notes. But because he had perfect pitch, he found them every time. He played the soft tune, his eyes closed, letting the music fill him up. For a few minutes, he wasn't the poor maid's son. He wasn't the kid who wasn't supposed to touch nice things. He was just a musician. The music flowed out of him, pure and honest. Unbeknownst to Leo, he was not alone. Standing in the archway of the sunroom, hidden partially by a large velvet curtain, was Mrs. Sterling. She had returned home early to retrieve a forgotten necklace. She had walked into the house expecting silence, but instead she heard music. At first she thought it was the radio. She thought perhaps her husband had come home and was listening to a recording. But as she walked closer to the living hall, she realized it was live music. It was someone playing the piano. She stopped in her tracks and peered around the curtain. What she saw made her stop breathing. There, sitting at her $100,000 instrument, was the housekeeper's son. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who valued order and rules. She believed that everyone had a place in the world, and they should stay in it. She viewed her staff as necessary, but she didn't view them as equals. Seeing Leo at the piano felt like a violation. It felt like a trespass. She watched his fingers move. She listened to the melody. It was simple, Yes, but it was played with an emotion that surprised her. He wasn't just hitting keys. He was feeling them. Mrs. Sterling felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was annoyed. How dare he touch the piano without permission? But another part of her was curious. She knew music. She had spent years paying for expensive lessons for her own children, lessons they complained about and skipped. They played because they had to. This boy played like he needed to. She stepped out from the shadows. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile floor. The sound cut through the music like a knife. Leo froze. His hands hovered over the keys as the last note faded away. He spun around on the bench, his face turning pale. He saw Mrs. Sterling standing there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't a frown either. It was a cold, calculated look. "I'm sorry," Leo stammered, jumping up from the bench. He stood with his hands behind his back, staring at his shoes. "I didn't mean to. Mrs. Sterling walked slowly into the room. She didn't look at the boy immediately. She looked at the piano. She ran a finger over the smooth wood, checking for dust or fingerprints. Then she turned her gaze to Leo. She saw the fear in his eyes. She saw the worn clothes he was wearing, hand-me-downs that were slightly too big. She saw the potential embarrassment of having to fire his mother because her son couldn't follow rules. "You have a good ear," Mrs. Sterling said finally. Her voice was smooth, but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of voice that gave orders and expected them to be followed. Leo looked up, surprised. "Thank you, ma'am." "My son has been taking lessons for 3 years," she continued, walking a slow circle around the boy. "He complains every day. He says it is too hard. He says his fingers hurt." Stopped in front of him. "Yet you, with no lessons and no permission, sit there and play a tune that sounds pleasant." She paused, tilting her head to the side. A thought was forming in her mind. It wasn't a kind thought. It was a thought born of boredom and a desire to prove a point. She wanted to show the world that talent was nothing without discipline, and that money was the only thing that really mattered. "Your mother tells me you think you are special," Mrs. Sterling said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "She says you have a gift." Leo shook his head quickly. "No, ma'am. I just like the sounds." "Do not lie to me," she snapped. "I heard you. You have a gift." She stepped closer, looming over him. "But gifts are cheap. Everyone has a gift. The world is full of talented people who are nothing. They are poor, they are hungry, and they are unknown." She walked over to a bookshelf and pulled out a thick, heavy book of sheet music. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. It was a piece by a difficult classical composer. She walked back to the piano and placed the open book on the stand. "This is the piece my son is supposed to learn for his recital," she said, tapping the paper. "He cannot play it. His teacher says it requires a special touch. A touch that cannot be taught." Leo looked at the pages. The notes were crowded together, black ants on a white page. They looked like a foreign language. He looked back at Mrs. Sterling, his heart pounding in his chest. "I can't read that," he whispered. Mrs. Sterling smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of someone setting a trap. "I know you can't. That is the point." She looked down at him, enjoying his fear. She wanted to crush him. She wanted to prove that he was just a servant's child who got lucky with a few notes. "I will make you a deal," she said softly. "You play this piece for me? You play it perfectly right here, right now, without missing a single note. And if you do—" She paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence stretch out. "I will adopt you," Leo gasped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Adoption? It meant a warm bed every night. It meant food on the table. It meant he never had to see his mother scrub floors again. It was a dream. But Mrs. Sterling continued, her voice hardening. "If you miss one note, if you stumble, if you sound anything less than perfect, then you never touch this piano again. You go back to your corner, you stay silent, and you accept that your place is here to serve, not to perform."
Oh.
She gestured to the bench. "Sit down." Leo's legs felt like lead. He looked toward the garden doors. wishing his mother would walk in. But the garden was empty. He was alone with this woman who held his future in her hands. He knew she didn't want him to succeed. She wanted him to fail. She wanted to humiliate him. But the hope, the tiny, flickering light of hope, was too strong to ignore. If he could just do this, he could save his mother. Slowly, painfully, Leo sat back down on the bench. The sheet music in front of him looked impossible. It was a mountain he didn't know how to climb. He placed his shaking hands over the keys. Mrs. Sterling stood over him, her arms crossed, watching like a vulture waiting for its meal. "Begin," she commanded. Leo took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He didn't know the notes on the page, but he knew the sound of the music in his head. He closed his eyes for a brief second, praying for a miracle, and then he pressed down on the first key. The challenge had begun. Leo sat on the padded bench, his small body trembling like a leaf in a breeze. The grand piano in front of him, which usually looked like a magical friend, now looked like a monster. The pages of the thick music book were open wide, showing him rows and rows of black notes. They were crowded together so tightly that they looked like swarms of insects crawling over the white paper. To Leo, who had never learned to read music, it was a terrifying maze. Mrs. Sterling stood right beside him. She did not sit down. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, staring down at him. She was waiting for him to fail. She wanted to see the look of defeat on his face, so she could point to it and say, "See? You are just a servant. You do not belong here." Leo stared at his hands. They were resting on the white keys, shaking so much that he was afraid he would hit a note just by accident. He knew he couldn't read the music. He didn't know what those little black dots meant. He didn't know which fingers were supposed to go where. He only had his ears and his memory. He pressed down on the first key. It was a low, heavy note that rumbled through the floor. Then he lifted his hand and tried to find the next one. He played slowly, painfully. He was trying to mimic the sound of the song he had heard before, but he couldn't remember the complicated middle part clang. He hit a wrong note. It sounded harsh and ugly in the quiet room. Mrs. Sterling let out a sharp, cold laugh. "Stop," she commanded. Leo froze. He pulled his hands away from the keyboard as if the piano had burned him. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "That was pathetic," she said, shaking her head slowly. "You thought you could just bang on the keys and call it music? This is a composition by a master. It requires intelligence. It requires years of training, not just feelings." She reached out and slammed the music book shut. The loud thud made Leo jump. "I knew you couldn't do it," Mrs. Sterling said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "My son struggles with this piece, and he has the best teachers in the city. You are just a boy who cleans floors." She turned her back on him and walked toward the window to look at her garden. "Get up, go back to your corner, and remember our deal. You lost. You do not touch this piano ever again." Leo slid off the bench. He felt tears stinging the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him cry. He walked quietly back to his small wooden chair in the corner of the room. He sat down and pulled his knees up to his chest, making himself as small as possible. Later that evening, his mother Maria came to collect him. She looked tired. Her apron had a fresh stain on it from dinner preparation, and her hair was falling out of its bun. She smiled softly when she saw Leo. "Ready to go home, sweetie?" she asked. Leo nodded, but he couldn't look her in the eye. He felt ashamed. He had failed. He had let his only chance slip through his fingers because he wasn't good enough. As they walked out of the grand estate and toward their small car parked at the end of the long driveway, the silence was heavy. Usually, Leo would tell his mother about the things he saw in the house or the birds he watched. Today, he said nothing. Once they were inside their small, modest apartment, Maria put her bag down. She looked at Leo's sad face. She could tell something was wrong. She knelt down in front of him. "Leo, what happened today? Did you get in trouble?" Leo looked at the scarred table in their tiny kitchen. "Mrs. Sterling heard me play," he whispered. Maria's eyes widened. "She did. She made me stop," Leo said, his voice cracking. She put a hard book of music in front of me. She told me to play it. She said if I played it perfectly, she would. She would adopt us. She would make me her son so we could have money and food. Maria gasped. She put a hand over her mouth. That was a cruel promise to make to a child. And what happened? She asked gently. Leo finally let the tears come. I couldn't do it, Mama. I couldn't read the notes. I messed up. She laughed at me. She said I was just a servant. Maria pulled her son into a tight hug. She held him against her shoulder, rocking him back and forth. Oh, my sweet boy, she whispered. That was a terrible thing for her to do. She set you up to fail. She wanted to hurt you. Leo pulled back and wiped his nose. But maybe she was right. I'm not smart enough. I don't know how to read the music. I just hear it in my head. I wish I was like her son. I wish I could go to school and learn. Maria looked at her son. She saw the defeat in his posture, and it broke her heart. She grabbed his shoulders firmly and made him look at her. You listen to me, Leo. You are smart. You are the smartest person I know. You have a gift inside you that money cannot buy. She sees notes on a page. You see the music in the air. You feel it. But I can't play the song, Leo cried. Then you don't play it for her, Maria said fiercely. You play it for you. She gave me 1 week, Leo said. She said I have 1 week to practice, and then she will invite people over to watch me fail. Maria stood up. She walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up a spoon. She tapped it against a glass. Clink. Clink. It made a clear, high-pitched sound. What are you doing? Leo asked. You need to practice, but you can't touch the piano at the house, Maria said. So you practice here. You practice here until your fingers hurt. She handed him the spoon. Show me what she showed you. The song. Leo closed his eyes. He tried to remember the way the music had moved in his head when he heard it before. He began to tap the handle of the spoon against the table. Tap, 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 tap. It was a clumsy sound. Not like a piano, but it had a rhythm. That's it, Maria encouraged him. Feel the beat. Don't worry about the black dots on the paper. You know the song. You know how it goes up and down. You know the happy parts and the sad parts. Trust your ears. For the next 7 days, the small apartment was filled with the sounds of tapping. Leo tapped on the table. He tapped on the windowsill. He tapped on his knees while he ate his dinner. He walked to school and tapped on his legs, humming the tune under his breath. He lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, his fingers moving in the air as he played the invisible piano. During this time, he didn't go near the Sterling house. Maria told him to stay outside, to play in the park, to be anywhere but near that piano. Mrs. Sterling had given orders that Leo was not to touch the instrument. So Maria made sure he wouldn't even be tempted. But the music was growing inside him. It was changing. At first, he was just trying to copy the notes he had heard. But as he tapped and hummed, he started to understand the story of the song. It wasn't just noise. It was a story about a bird flying high in the sky, getting caught in a storm, and then finding its way home to the sun. Leo knew that story. He felt like that bird sometimes. He started to add his own feelings to the tapping. When the bird was flying, he tapped lightly and quickly. When the storm came, he hit the table harder, making the sound deep and angry. When the bird found the sun, his hands moved smoothly and softly. The week went by slowly. Each day, Leo felt the pressure building. He knew that the deadline was coming. He knew Mrs. Sterling was preparing a room full of people to watch him crash and burn. She wanted to prove that poor people with no training were nothing. On the final day before the challenge, Maria came home from work early. She looked tired, but her eyes were shining. She walked into the living room, where Leo was tapping on the sofa armrest. Stop for a moment, she said. Leo stopped. He looked at her hands. They were red and rough, covered in small cuts from cleaning all day. She worked harder than anyone he knew. She scrubbed the floors of a woman who hated her, just to put bread on his table. Do you know why I want you to do this? Maria asked him. Is it for the money? Leo thought about it. A little, he admitted. It's okay to want a better life, Maria said, but that is not why we are doing this. We are doing this because she tried to break your spirit. She tried to tell you that you are nothing. Tomorrow, when you sit at that piano, you are not playing for her. You are not playing to be adopted. You are playing to show her that she cannot define who you are." Leo nodded. He understood. It wasn't about the notes. It was about the heart. "She thinks you need fancy lessons to be great," Maria said, brushing his hair out of his eyes. "But great music comes from the soul. Your soul is full of music, Leo. More than she will ever have." She pulled him into a hug. "You don't need her adoption to be my son. You are already the best thing in my life. Just go in there tomorrow and play like you mean it. Play like the bird who finally found the sun." Leo took a deep breath. The fear was still there, sitting in the pit of his stomach like a heavy stone. But underneath the fear, there was something else. It was a fire. It was the feeling of his mother's hands on his shoulders. The sound of her voice telling him to believe in himself. He looked at the coffee table one last time. He tapped out the final run of the song, the part where the bird soars into the clouds. His fingers moved so fast they were almost a blur. "I will do it, Mama," Leo said, looking up with a fierce determination in his eyes. "I will play every note, and I will play it for you." Maria smiled, and for the first time all week, Leo didn't feel like a failure. He felt like a musician who was ready for his concert. The next morning arrived with a brightness that seemed to mock the nervous feeling in Leo's stomach. The sun shone down on the Sterling estate, making the windows sparkle like diamonds. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere was tense and busy. Mrs. Sterling had spent the entire morning on the phone inviting important people from the city. There were businessmen in expensive suits, women in glittering jewelry, and even a few critics from the local papers. She wanted witnesses. She didn't just want Leo to fail. She wanted an audience to see the difference between old money and a poor boy's dreams. Mrs. Sterling walked through the hallways, pointing at decorations and giving orders to the staff. "Make sure the silver shines," she told Maria, "and straighten the rugs. Today this house must look perfect." Maria nodded and got to work. She didn't look at her son, but she gave his hand a quick squeeze as she passed him. Leo was standing in the corner of the room wearing his best clothes. They were simple gray trousers and a white shirt that Maria had ironed until it was crisp. He looked neat, but compared to the rich guests arriving in shiny cars, he looked very small. He felt out of place, like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cage of peacocks. Leo's heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Thump, thump, thump. He kept his hands in his pockets so no one would see them shaking. He looked at the grand piano. It sat in the center of the room, the lid open, looking majestic and terrifying. Mrs. Sterling had placed the difficult sheet music on the stand. The black note seemed to stare back at him, daring him to make a mistake. The room began to fill with people. They held glasses of expensive juice and wine, laughing and talking loudly. Every time someone let out a burst of laughter, Leo flinched. He felt like they were all laughing at him already. Mrs. Sterling moved through the crowd like a queen, greeting her guests with a cold smile. "Thank you for coming," she said to a tall man in a gray suit. "We have a little treat for you today. A demonstration of natural talent, if you can call it that." She laughed, and the man laughed with her, though he didn't know what was going on. Leo tried to focus. He closed his eyes for a second and remembered the kitchen table. He remembered the tapping. Tap, tap. He could hear the rhythm in his head. He could feel the story of the bird trying to fly. It was calming him down, but only a little. His hands were sweating, and he wiped them on his trousers. "Where's the boy?" A woman's voice rang out. "Let's see this prodigy." Mrs. Sterling walked over to Leo. She loomed over him, her shadow covering him. "It is time," she said quietly. "Do not embarrass me, and remember the deal. If you miss, you never touch this piano again." Leo looked up at her. He wanted to be scared, but he remembered his mother's words. "You are playing for yourself." He took a deep breath and nodded. He walked slowly toward the piano. The crowd parted to let him through, their eyes following him. Some looked curious, some looked bored, and some looked pitying. He sat down on the bench. It was plush and soft. He adjusted his height. He stared at the keyboard. The white keys looked long and smooth. The black keys looked sharp. He looked at the sheet music. It was just a blur of ink. He didn't know what any of it meant. He couldn't read the first note. Mrs. Sterling stood near the window, her arms crossed. "The piece is The Storm and the Bird," she announced to the room. "My son has been learning it for months. This boy," she pointed a manicured finger at Leo, "thinks he can play it by ear. With no training, today," the room went quiet. The guests stopped talking. They looked at the small boy and the big piano. They didn't think he could do it. They were waiting for a joke. Leo closed his eyes. He blocked out the faces. He blocked out the expensive dresses and the shiny watches. He imagined he was back in his kitchen. He imagined the smell of his mother's cooking. He imagined the sound of the spoon hitting the table. "Start slow," the music in his head said. "Start with the morning." Leo lifted his hands. He didn't look at the paper. He didn't need to. He placed his fingers on the keys and pressed down. The first note was clear and soft, like a drop of water. Then came the second and the third. He began to play. It was the start of the song, the part where the bird is just waking up. The melody was simple and sweet. People in the room started to whisper. "He's actually playing," someone whispered. "But it's just the easy part," someone else replied. Leo kept going. His fingers moved from key to key. He didn't know the names of the notes, but he knew the distance between them. He knew exactly how far his hand had to stretch to get the sound he wanted. He played the opening section perfectly. There were no mistakes. The sound was pure and clean. Mrs. Sterling frowned slightly. She shifted her weight. She had expected him to fail immediately. She waited for the hard part, the middle of the song where the music gets fast and complicated. Leo's hands picked up speed. The song changed. The quiet morning was over. The wind was starting to blow. Leo hit the keys a little harder. The sound grew louder and stronger. He swayed slightly with the music, his body moving with the rhythm. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was just feeling. His hands seemed to have a mind of their own, dancing across the white and black ivory. The guests stopped whispering. They started to watch. Really watch. They saw the concentration on the boy's face. They saw the way his hands moved with a confidence that didn't match his clothes. It wasn't just hitting notes. It was telling a story. Then came the storm. This was the hardest part of the song. The music became chaotic and loud. There were low notes that rumbled like thunder and high notes that splashed like rain. Leo's left hand moved down the keyboard while his right hand jumped up and down. It required focus and speed. Leo didn't hesitate. He slammed his hands down for the thunder crashes, then gently caressed the keys for the falling rain. Boom, dash, tap, dash, tap, dash, tap. He was playing exactly what he had practiced on the table. He didn't miss a single beat. The sound filled the large hall, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. It was powerful. It was so loud that the woman in the front row put down her glass. Mrs. Sterling's mouth opened slightly. She walked closer to the piano, her eyes fixed on his hands. She was looking for a slip, a fumble, a hesitation. She wanted to see him get confused, but his fingers were sure. They knew exactly where to go. He was playing better than her son had ever played. He was playing with a passion that her son, with all his lessons, simply did not have. The storm and the music reached its peak. The room was filled with a roaring, beautiful sound. Leo's face was serious, his eyebrows furrowed in effort. He was fighting the storm, guiding the bird through the wind. He hit a complicated run of notes, a cascade of sound that usually took years to master. His fingers were a blur then. Suddenly the chaos stopped. Silence hung in the air for a split second. Leo took a breath. The storm was over. He began to play the final part of the song. It was soft and gentle. The bird had found the sun. The music was warm and happy. Leo's hands slowed down. He played the final notes with a tenderness that made some of the guests hold their breath. He wasn't just pressing keys. He was pouring his heart out into the room. He was thinking about his mother and their small kitchen, and how much he loved music. He played the very last chord. He let it ring out, echoing into the silence. He held his hands over the keys, letting the sound fade away until there was nothing left but the quiet breathing of the people in the room. Leo sat there for a moment, his chest rising and falling. He was done. He didn't turn around. He was terrified to look at their faces. He was terrified he had missed something and just hadn't realized it. Slowly, he turned on the bench to face the room. Mrs. Sterling was standing just a few feet away. She looked pale. Her carefully arranged expression of superiority was gone, replaced by a look of shock. She couldn't speak. The guests were silent too. It was the kind of silence that comes after something truly amazing happens. When people are too moved to speak immediately, then, from the back of the room, an older man in a tuxedo began to clap. Clap, clap, clap. It was slow and steady. Then, a woman near the front joined in. Within seconds, the whole room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was loud and enthusiastic. They were smiling. They were impressed. Leo looked through the crowd. He saw his mother standing by the door. She was crying, but she was smiling the biggest smile he had ever seen. She was clapping her hands together, wiping tears from her cheeks with her sleeve. Mrs. Sterling looked at the clapping crowd. Then at Leo. She felt a strange coldness in her stomach. The boy had done it. He had humiliated her by being better than she expected. She had lost her bet, and now she had to pay. The sound of applause filled the large hall like a wave crashing against the shore. For a boy who spent his life trying to be invisible, the noise was overwhelming. Leo sat frozen on the piano bench, his hands resting on his knees. He looked out at the sea of faces. People were smiling. Some were wiping their eyes. The rich, important guests who had ignored him only minutes ago were now looking at him with surprise and admiration. It was a dream come true, but it also felt very scary. Leo watched her. He saw the way her lips pressed together into a thin line. He saw the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't happy for him. She was angry that the game hadn't gone the way she planned. She had wanted him to fail, to prove that her money and her status made her better than him. By playing so well, he had ruined her story. The applause began to die down. The room became quiet again, waiting for someone to speak. Mrs. Sterling took a deep breath and smoothed the front of her expensive dress. She needed to take control of the situation. She walked over to Leo, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She stopped right in front of him. "A very interesting performance," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She didn't sound grateful. She sounded like she was reading a script she didn't like. "You managed to hit the right notes. I suppose natural talent can be surprising." She paused and looked around the room. "A deal is a deal. I told this boy that if he played the piece perfectly, I would adopt him. I would give him the life his mother cannot provide." A murmur went through the crowd. They nodded their heads. They admired Mrs. Sterling for keeping her word, or at least they admired the show of generosity. They thought it was a beautiful fairy tale ending. The poor orphan gets saved by the rich lady. Mrs. Sterling turned back to Leo. She reached out her hand, expecting him to take it. "Stand up, Leo," she said. "Come with me. We will have the lawyer start the paperwork tomorrow. You will have your own room, new clothes, and the best piano teachers in the country. You will never have to scrub a floor again." Leo looked at her hand. It was adorned with a heavy diamond ring that sparkled under the lights. He looked at the guests who were smiling and waiting for the happy ending. Then he looked past them, to the back of the room. Maria was standing there. She had stopped clapping. Her hands were clasped together in front of her chest, and her face was pale. She looked terrified. For the last week, the only thing keeping her going was the thought of this moment. Her son would have a better life. He would have security. He would have opportunities. She knew she couldn't give him those things. She knew that as he got older, she would just hold him back. But looking at her now, Leo felt a pain in his chest that was sharper than any fear he had ever felt. He saw the love in her eyes, but he also saw the heartbreak. She was ready to give him up. She was ready to lose him forever, just so he could be happy. She was willing to be alone so he could have a future. Mrs. Sterling's hand was still waiting. "Well," she asked, her voice sharp, "are you going to take my hand or not? This is your one chance at a real life." Leo looked back at the wealthy woman. He thought about the adoption. He thought about the big house. He thought about the grand piano he could play every day. It was everything he had ever dreamed of having. But then he looked at Mrs. Sterling's cold eyes. He realized that if he went with her, he wouldn't just be getting a new home. He would be losing his soul. Mrs. Sterling didn't want a son. She wanted a trophy. She wanted to say she owned the talented boy. She wanted to control him. If he lived with her, he wouldn't be allowed to sit in the kitchen and tap on the table. He wouldn't be allowed to play the music he felt in his heart. He would have to play what she wanted when she wanted. He would be a prisoner in a golden cage. Leo looked down at his own hands. They were small and brown, just like his mother's. They were the hands that held her when she was tired. They were the hands that helped her clean. They were the hands that played the piano with love, not with pride. He shook his head slowly. "No," Leo said. The word was quiet, but in the silent room it sounded like a shout. Mrs. Sterling froze. Her smile disappeared completely. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice dropping dangerously low. "What did you say?" "No," Leo said again, louder this time. He stood up from the bench. He didn't take her hand. He stepped back, putting distance between himself and the wealthy woman. "I won't go with you." The guests began to whisper again. They were confused. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. "Don't be a fool," Mrs. Sterling hissed, leaning down so only Leo could hear her, though her voice carried. "I am offering you a fortune. I am offering you a future. Do you want to be poor forever? Do you want to end up like your mother?" "She is my mother," Leo said, his voice shaking but firm. "And she is worth more than all your money." The room went dead silent. Mrs. Sterling straightened up, her face turning red with embarrassment and anger. "You are an ungrateful child. You are throwing away your life." "I played the song because I love music," Leo said, looking her in the eye. "Not because I wanted to be bought. You wanted to prove that I am nothing? But you were wrong. I am not nothing, and I am not yours." He turned away from her. He looked at the stunned faces of the guests, searching for a friendly one. He saw the older man in the tuxedo, the one who had started the applause. He was looking at Leo with deep interest. His name was Mr. Thorne, a famous music professor who had known Mrs. Sterling for years. He hadn't clapped because he was being polite. He had clapped because he recognized true genius when he heard it. Leo didn't wait for Mrs. Sterling to say anything else. He walked past her. He walked past the whispering crowd in their expensive clothes. He walked toward the back of the room, toward the only person who mattered. Maria was crying freely now. She had her hands over her mouth to stop the sobs from coming out. When Leo reached her, he didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around her waist and buried his face in her apron. It smelled like lemon, soap, and home. "I'm not leaving you, Mama," he whispered. Maria collapsed to her knees, hugging him back so tightly it almost hurt. She cried into his shoulder, holding on to him as if he might disappear. "Oh, Leo," she sobbed. "My brave, brave boy." Mrs. Sterling stood alone in the middle of the room. She looked at the weeping maid and her son. She looked at the guests who were no longer looking at her with admiration, but with judgment. She felt like she had been slapped. She had tried to play God and she had lost. Mr. Thorne stepped forward. He walked slowly to the center of the room. He ignored Mrs. Sterling completely. He walked over to where Leo and Maria were hugging on the floor. He stood there for a moment, waiting for them to look up. Leo lifted his head. He saw the old man looking down at him. "That was the most honest performance I have heard in 30 years, Mr. Thorne said gently. He had a kind face and a warm voice. "You play with a voice that most musicians spend their whole lives trying to find." Maria wiped her eyes and tried to stand up, keeping a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "But we are leaving now." "Wait," Mr. Thorne said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a card. He handed it to Maria. "I run the city conservatory. It is a school for music. The best school. Maria looked at the card, then at him, confused. I don't understand. Have a scholarship, Mr. Thorne said, looking at Leo. A full scholarship. It covers tuition, books, and even a new piano to practice on. But usually, we only give it to older students. He smiled at the boy. However, for a student with this much passion, I think I can make an exception, Maria gasped. A scholarship? You mean he can go to your school? Yes, Mr. Thorne nodded. And there is one condition. Psh. Maria's heart sank. She feared he was going to ask for the same thing Mrs. Sterling did. She gripped Leo's shoulder tighter. The condition, Mr. Thorne continued, is that he must keep playing with that same heart, and that he stays with the person who gave him that heart. Maria let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for a week. She started to cry again, but this time they were tears of relief. Thank you, she choked out. Thank you so much. Leo smiled up at the professor. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes. I can stay with my mama. You can stay with your mama, Mr. Thorne confirmed. Mrs. Sterling cleared her throat loudly, trying to get the attention back. This is highly irregular, she snapped. You cannot just take a boy off the street. Mr. Thorne turned to look at her. He didn't look angry, just disappointed. Madam, he said softly, so everyone could hear, you tried to buy this boy. You tried to own his gift. You didn't see a musician? You saw a pet? That is why you lost him. You have a beautiful house, but it is empty of the one thing that matters. He turned his back on her and looked back at Leo and Maria. Shall we go? I believe we have much to discuss about your future, young man. Leo looked at his mother. She nodded, her face glowing with pride. Yes, Leo said. We are ready. Leo took his mother's hand. Together, they walked past the angry Mrs. Sterling, past the silent guests, and out the large archway of the hall. They walked into the sunlight, leaving the cold, empty mansion behind them. They didn't have the millions of dollars Mrs. Sterling had. They didn't have the big house. But as they stepped out the front door, hand in hand, they had everything they needed. They had each other, and they had the music. The sunlight hit Leo's face as he walked out of the Sterling estate, but it felt different than it had just an hour ago. Before, the sun had felt like a spotlight exposing his simple clothes and his nervousness. Now it felt like a warm embrace. He walked down the long driveway, his hand tightly gripping his mother's hand. He didn't look back at the big house with its shiny windows and perfect gardens. He didn't need to see Mrs. Sterling standing in the window, watching them leave with a scowl on her face. That part of his life was over. The drive home in their old beat-up car was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, scared silence of the week before. Maria kept looking over at Leo as she drove, her eyes shining with tears that she kept wiping away. Every time she looked at him, she smiled. It was a smile that said, I can't believe you are my son. Mama, Leo asked from the passenger seat. Are we okay? We are more than okay, Leo, Maria said, her voice trembling slightly. We are free. We don't have to worry about what she thinks anymore. We don't have to be afraid, Leo nodded. He looked out the window at the passing trees. For so long, he had thought that being adopted by Mrs. Sterling was the only way to be someone. He thought that having a big house and expensive things was what made a person important. But standing in that hall, rejecting her offer, he had felt stronger than he ever felt when he was playing the piano. He realized that his worth didn't come from a piece of paper or a wealthy lady. It came from inside him. When they got home to their small apartment, it felt different too. The furniture was old and the rooms were small, but the air felt lighter. It smelled like dinner cooking in a neighbor's apartment and the sweet scent of the flowers. Maria kept in a pot on the windowsill. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. The next few days were a whirlwind of changes, but good changes. Mr. Thorne, the music professor, was true to his word. He came to visit them at their apartment the very next day. He didn't wear a suit this time. He wore a simple sweater and slacks. He sat with them at their small kitchen table, drinking tea out of chipped mugs, and he talked to them like they were old friends. I have arranged everything, Mr. Thorne told them. Leo will start at the conservatory in the fall. He will have the best teachers. But there is something special I want to do now. He pulled out a set of keys from his pocket and slid them across the table toward Leo. What is this? Leo asked, looking at the silver keys. A local shop has agreed to lend us a piano, Mr. Thorne said. It is not a brand new grand piano like Mrs. Sterling has. It is an upright piano. It is a little old, and it has a few scratches. But the sound is beautiful. I thought it might fit better in here. Leo's eyes went wide. A piano here? If that is all right with your mother, Mr. Thorne said, smiling at Maria. Maria covered her mouth with her hands. She looked around the tiny living room. There was barely enough space for the sofa and the television. But where will we put it? She laughed. We will make space, she decided instantly. We will move the table. We will move anything. He needs a piano. 2 days later, the delivery men brought the piano. It was big and heavy, and it barely squeezed through the front door. They had to take the legs off to get it into the living room, and when they finally put it together, it took up almost half the wall. The sofa was pushed against the other wall, and the little table was squished into the corner. The room was cramped and crowded, but to Leo, it was perfect. He sat down on the bench. The piano smelled like wood and dust. It didn't have the high gloss of the Sterling piano, but when he pressed a key, the sound was warm and woody. It felt friendly. He played a simple chord, and the notes filled the small apartment, vibrating off the walls. This wasn't a showroom where people judged you. This was home. Leo practiced every day. He practiced scales, and he practiced the difficult songs Mr. Thorne gave him. But he also played his own music. He played the songs he heard in his head, the songs about the birds and the wind. Sometimes, Maria would sit and listen while she folded laundry. Sometimes, she would hum along. She didn't understand the notes, but she understood the feeling. A few weeks later, Leo had his first recital at the conservatory. It was a small event just for the students and their families. There were no fancy gowns or expensive tuxedos. There were just folding chairs and a stage with a simple curtain. Leo was nervous. His hands were shaking a little as he walked onto the stage. He looked out into the audience. He saw Mr. Thorne sitting in the front row, nodding encouragingly. And right behind him, he saw Maria. She had taken the day off work. She was wearing her best dress, a simple blue one she hadn't worn in years. She had fixed her hair, and she was holding a small bouquet of flowers she had bought herself. When she saw Leo looking at her, she didn't wave or shout. She just put her hand over her heart and mouthed the words, "I love you." Leo took a deep breath. He sat down at the piano. He looked at the keys. He thought about Mrs. Sterling. He wondered if she knew about this. He wondered if she would care. He realized that it didn't matter. She wanted to own a musician, but she didn't understand that music can't be owned. It has to be free. He started to play. He played a complex piece by batch, one that required focus and discipline. His fingers flew over the keys, steady and sure. He played every note perfectly, just like he had done in the big house. But this time, he wasn't trying to prove anything to a rich lady. He was playing for the joy of it. The sound was clear and bright. The people in the audience stopped whispering. They watched the boy on the stage. They could see the change in him. He wasn't the scared servant's boy anymore. He was a young man with a gift, and he was sharing it. When he finished the last note, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then the applause started. It wasn't the polite clapping of high society. It was genuine, warm applause. The students and their families were clapping because they loved the music. Maria clapped the loudest. Tears streamed down her face. Happy tears this time. Her sun was shining. He didn't need a mansion to do it. He just needed a chance. After the recital, people came up to Leo to congratulate him. They told him how talented he was. They told him he was going to be a great pianist one day. Leo shook their hands and thanked them. Smiling shyly, eventually the crowd cleared out, and Mr. Thorne came over with Maria. He put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "You did well, Leo," the professor said. "You have a bright future ahead of you. But you know what the best part is?" Leo looked up at him. "What?" "The best part is that you will never have to play to impress anyone again," Mr. Thorne said. You only have to play to express yourself. That is what real music is. They walked out of the building into the cool evening air. The city was buzzing with life. Cars honked, and people walked by chatting and laughing. It was a normal Tuesday night, but to Leo and Maria, it felt magical. They walked toward the bus stop. They didn't have a driver or a fancy car. They were going to take the bus, just like they always did. "Mama?" Leo asked as they waited. "Do you think Mrs. Sterling ever thinks about me?" Maria thought about it for a moment. She looked at the dark sky, then down at her son. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe she hears a piano on the radio and wonders, but it doesn't matter, Leo. She wanted to change you into something else. She wanted to mold you like a piece of clay. But you aren't clay. You are a song. And songs cannot be kept in a cage." The bus pulled up, its brakes hissing. They climbed on board and found 2 seats at the back. Through the window, the city lights blurred by. Leo watched the reflection of his face in the glass. He looked happy. He looked content. He realized that the result was indeed incredible, just not in the way Mrs. Sterling had planned. She thought the incredible result would be her adopting a poor boy and taking credit for his talent. But the real miracle was different. The miracle was that a poor boy and his mother faced a giant and won. They walked away from the money and kept their dignity. They found a way to turn a cruel game into a beautiful future. Leo leaned his head on his mother's shoulder as the bus drove through the streets. He closed his eyes and hummed a soft tune. He was ready for whatever came next. He was a musician, he was a son, and most importantly, he was free. And that was the greatest success of all.